I cannot begin to even summarize her 40 years of human rights and human development experience. We would be here all day just for that. But I am so spectacularly thankful that you're here, and also as one of my sort of personal mentors in the space when I was getting started. So it's fantastic moments for me personally. And Rabbi Melinda Zalma, who is the manager of programs in Tanenbaum, some of you might be very familiar with her, and she's also a chaplain within the US Navy. So with that, I will hand it off to our wonderful speaker.
Thank you. So Azza, just like this, I'm very excited to be here. I was just really pleased to be able to speak with you. I'm very excited about our conversation. So just as an introduction, will you give us some highlights of those amazing 40 years of how you worked to really help people navigate differences, to build peace and to build understanding, and especially in respect to religion?
First of all, it's a tremendous privilege and joy to be with you all here today. I think this is a gift, and I'm deeply grateful to each and all of you for it, and most especially to Tanenbaum, which I have been a long-standing fan of ever since I heard of it, and I made sure the United Nations system was made aware and integrated and included. Talk about DEI, the work of Tanenbaum in its faith-based and faith-inspired outreach. So thank you, and absolute joy to be here with you, Rabbi. I have a healthy regard for all religious leaders, especially when they're women. I like the men too. I've worked with all kinds of faith leaders and cultural leaders and so on. So it's always a privilege, and I learn every day. I wouldn't assume that I've got the understanding of how to resolve situations of difference, especially religious difference. I will share a very small story, if I may. It was mid-2000 when the first Israeli attacks against Gaza were taking place at that time. There was a certain amount of turbulence, and I was still at the UN. And I recall being in the elevator with my colleagues, and I was wearing this, which is the Allah sign, the name of God, according to Islam. And a colleague whom I didn't know, I hadn't met her yet, I hadn't worked with her, was wearing something with the Hebrew. I think it was, I don't know what it was, but it was Hebrew. And I remember we both sort of looked at each other across the elevator. We didn't say anything, but there was this moment of, I think both of us felt a bit uncomfortable. When you work for the United Nations, like many other international organizations I'm sure you're familiar with, you're kind of meant to put your identity, political, national, religious, regional, whatever it is, gender, you're kind of meant to put it aside and not be seen as representing that particular series of identities. So since that time, I learned to put this inside. And for the remaining, I think at that time it was about 10 years left. For the remaining decade of working in the UN, I kept this inside. I didn't keep it outside. The reason being, I didn't wish to cause a sense of discomfort to anyone. I wanted this to be not the source of, oh, she's from that, just like I had done, like, oh, he's from that. And it was only later that I realized, reflecting, that actually that should have been an opportunity to encounter. But at that time, and it was still very much in the beginnings of working in this kind of a international, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-everything space, that it was immediately a sign of, ooh, one better be careful, because I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I just want to say that that was a source of learning for me, because it would have taken a certain amount of courage to see that difference, even at that moment of intense polarization, disagreement, whatever you call it, outright conflict. It takes a certain amount of courage to see that as an opportunity to reach out, as opposed to the knee-jerk reaction is, all right, fine, I'm not, it's okay. I'm not who, it doesn't matter who I am, where I am from, and what I come, don't be uncomfortable. Please don't be uncomfortable. It takes a certain amount of courage to go from please don't be uncomfortable to why don't we just embrace each other's discomfort, and how else can we find spaces that we can actually connect to with one another? That skill set, which you've all been talking about and all of you represent in your daily work, takes learning, takes exercise. It doesn't come naturally to anyone. We're not born with this skill set. And this is one of the most critical understandings, is that when you work in international, interreligious or whatever, the assumption is you got it. You know how to fit in, you know how to work, you know how to be tactful, you know how to be skillful, you know how to be diplomatic. And actually, those are the moments when the diversity is at its height. It's many diversities coming together that you actually most need to be learned about that skill set. I think many of you have already spoken about the lived who we are. The other panel, I understand, from Mark also addressed this, that you look at your lived realities as a form of experience. I do think that some of us have had lived realities which perhaps accentuate the distance rather than bring us closer. So again, it's skill sets that are learned with one another, but the assumption that just because we're diverse and we're all together, we're going to get along just fine because this is the whole purpose of being here is a very dangerous assumption. We miss out on what we have to learn from one another.
You work for, you founded a very interesting organization that really works to help people on a global level. Can you tell us more about that organization? I know in our lead up conversation, the opportunity that even the structure of your organization provides to really making an impact in many different places.
So it's an experiment. It is a management consultancy, international, multi-religious, etc., women-led, faith-based, not women-centered, by the way, women-led, but not women-centered. So everybody assumes we know everything about child marriage and female genital mutilation. And then I'm like, yes, but there's plenty more that women know about. And just because women read doesn't mean that women's issues, whatever that is all we do. It's one of the many things that get done. But it's an experiment because it's actually a not-for-profit operating as a for-profit. And I am not aware of any other such examples. If you are, please enlighten me. But this is the first time that effectively a very deliberate intent to bring together the people whom over 40 years of working in different parts of the world on different sets of issues, I have had such admiration, respect for, but also trust in, because I realized that one of the most, if you will, sacred aspects of engaging with one another is the aspect of trust. And just because we're all supposed to trust, again, doesn't mean it automatically happens. In fact, if anything, again, trust is one of those things you so have to work on and build. And very often, in many institutions, it's actually not there. If you look at the way we're working with each other as countries, as nations, there is so very little trust. It's all based on interest, and if you fulfill this, then I can fulfill that. And it's the reciprocity of interest as opposed to the reciprocity of trust. And that's where faith organizations, religious institutions were supposed to bring in that newness, that relative, if you will. We don't think about interest, we think about trust, right? That was what I assumed religions do, is they work together, they coexist based on mutual trust, only to realize that every single institution has to have an interest-based way of thinking. Every single institution, whether they're corporate, non-governmental, educational, It doesn't matter, but there is a certain contract that entails interest base, which in some cases mitigates against trust. Because if we've agreed the terms of our contract, it doesn't necessarily mean we trust each other. It simply means we've agreed the terms of our contract. Trust is a completely different thing. It may come with fulfilling the terms of our contract, but it is not an automatic thing. So it was the people that I had learned to trust over many years of working together that I reached out to, and I said, would you be willing to be a partner with this initiative to make ourselves, basically make our wisdom available to any who would ask, and it has to have pro bono component. We also need to get paid, which is a much more difficult business. The pro bono is easy, very easy. Yes, what can I do for you? How can I help? Absolutely. How much do you charge? Okay. Realize that this is another brain that is required right here, because all my life I've been paid and I didn't need to set a charge. And now each one of us is struggling with how do we start charge, or what should our rate be? Why is that okay? Why, etc. So we're learning as we're doing this. So it's a very new experiment, but the most amazing thing about it is we're compiling a database of people like yourselves who are faith inspired, by no means representing their respective religion necessarily, if they want to, absolutely, but they're not there in their religious capacity with their religious hat. They're there as a rocket scientist, a teacher, a medical doctor, an engineer. It's the profession that we have. Some of us are also reverends and rabbis, but we're not there in our religious capacity per se. We're there as professionals. The minimum level of experience and expertise is 20 years. But we got approached by so many young people who were like, why do you not have us as also experts? And we talked about it and realized, of course you can have youth experts, for heaven's sake. So the if you will, the bar for years of experience is not necessary for the young people, but they're faith inspired. They have experience and expertise, and they want to be available. Effectively, it's a global community of professionals inspired by their respective faith. Oh, and you should have seen the moment when the lady who's a Catholic who works for one of the Vatican's offices first came to me face to face with another person who's a Wiccan. And she was like, "You're a what?" Says, "I'm a witch," she said. And it was a beautiful moment. And it was like, oh, okay. Great. What do you do again? But it's those moments of meeting across very unexpected boundaries of faith, because we're not saying faith has to look like this and be like that and represent this way. It's whatever inspires you that is your faith. So that's lead integrity. And the naming was deliberate because we looked around us everywhere in the world, whether we were in Malawi or South Africa or Chile or Cairo or New York, and we realized we have a very huge absence of leadership. We maybe not so long ago for some of us, we remember Nelson Mandela, we remember Bishop Tutu, we remember those amazing leaders. It's hard to name one now, I think. And I think that is massive as an absence in our lives, all of our lives. So leadership is a very important point. But also we understand it comes from learning and skills, but competence and integrity are part of that. So it's not any leadership, there's plenty leaders out there, but it's a leadership that encompasses and exemplifies integrity and competence, because some people think, well, this person is a beautiful human being. They're so amazing in their particular job, and not necessarily terribly competent when you put them to do X. Well, guess what? The experts that are here in this space are actually competent, they're leaders, and they exemplify integrity.
That just sounds fascinating. I'm really excited to have learned about your organization and to learn more. And there are a number of things that you've brought up so far that really connect to what we've been talking about. And this your example of the Catholic and the Wiccan coming together, that your organization really works together across many differences to help bolster human flourishing. And you need to do that across these immense differences, but there's this common goal. And I know we heard from the panel in this panel this morning of that's also in the workplace that allows people that common goal of the mission of the company makes the opportunity for people to be able to work together. So will you talk some about some of the challenges you've seen as people strive to work together across these differences, and then follow on some strategies for overcoming those challenges?
Sure. I mean, I think each of you would be able to speak to this far better than I. So I'll just share a few anecdotes from working before in academia, in the UN, and in an international not-for-profit. In the academic setting, the distinction is often who publishes most, who gets to speak gets invited to different conferences most, etc. Those are the parameters of who's most competent. Doesn't matter what you publish, as long as it's a long list of publications. It's grand, it's amazing, it's fantastic, etc. So the culture is publish or perish. If you don't publish enough, it doesn't matter that you may be a residue of remarkable wisdom. It doesn't really matter. You haven't published. In a context like this, you understand eventually that this is only one of the parameters. It is simply one of the parameters added to many others. I taught in Northern Ireland, where 99% of the professors were Protestant, 75% were English, and 99% of the students were Catholic, and 99% Northern Irish. So you can already see what the dynamic would have been in any given classroom. Forget about the publish or perish. This is about relating to one another from within a dynamic where Protestant English is actually the dominant, and therefore the ones laying the truth. Whereas the recipients who are supposed to be recipients and engage, and very rarely did, so the student body would not question when it was time for Q&A. It didn't matter how many students there were. It was so rare to get a question. And I didn't understand this because I had come from a context where you always question. In the Middle East, the first time somebody has a chance, I got a question, because you want to challenge the knowledge that's being given to you. That's the Middle East. You come to Northern Ireland and there's not a single hand raised, and you speak to the professors, and they don't have a great educational system here, so the students are not that smart. Total blank when it came to understanding a power dynamic that was so darn obvious. It took me only a little while to understand that, wait, none of the students are smart? How? Anyway, so that was one of those challenges of saying you're supposed to relate and educate through engaging, but if you're not going to be questioned, your own knowledge as a professor will never improve. Because your knowledge as a professor improves when students challenge you, when they even just ask you simple questions. That's a dynamic. Move on to the context of the United Nations, where we are all global experts in everything, truly everything. I mean, the United Nations system has 60 plus entities, one of which is called the World Bank Group. If you guys know the World Bank is big, it's massive. One of the United Nations system universe is called that. So imagine literally any expertise anywhere in the world on any matter from everywhere in the world you shall find, including, the assumption is, the expertise on how to deal with one another when we are dramatically different human beings. We're actually very, very different. We come from every single part of the world. But we are experts on that when we are so definitely not. When the expression of may actually mean no. When simple things like that, in the way that we relate to one another, are problematic. When somebody's saying to you, but do you know, have you ever actually done X? Now, have you ever actually done X in a Western context is perhaps a genuine question, but maybe understood from another context as, are you kidding me? You don't know what I mean, hello, we've been working together. You hired me. You don't know that I've done this before. What do you mean? What do you mean when you ask that question? It immediately gets seen as, are you undermining my knowledge? Are you questioning what I can do? Now imagine a gazillion of these exchanges every day between people from different cultural contexts. Perfectly normal, absolutely expected. What is dramatically problematic is that nobody questions. Hello, do you understand that you guys have just really misunderstood one another? Really, very much misunderstood one another. And you're not even prepared to see that this is an issue, a problem. And it will be raised to the ombudsman eventually, and the ombudsman, the very Western cultural mentality, because that is the mentality within the system, will sit and try to seek a resolution. But the person who's seeking a resolution within an institution is actually also subservient to a certain way of thinking. So the multicultural, let alone the multi-religious, has not played a role at all. So it turns out that the multicultural is a monocultural. And that is a massive loss in terms of what we could have gained and can still gain from learning to be with one another. Fast forward to an international multi-religious organization where I have to serve as the head of a community of religious leaders, institutions from all over the world, every single institution and faith imaginable. And at some point within the very first month of my office, of my being able to serve in the office, I am told, there is no way that someone like you can have any authority over this community. And I ask, what, someone like me? Would you care to elaborate? I've been elected to do this, so what is it that I'm not doing right? But you have to understand that this is first and foremost a way for us as religious leaders to be seen, to be appreciative of where you come from, who you are. This isn't about you, it is about us. So when we choose you, we are making the statement that we are people of greatness and big heart. Yeah, I appreciate that very much, says me. What part of me is the source of this greatness and big heart, compassion? Thank you. You are where you come from. It is a hard time to be a Muslim today, is it not? But yet we expect and we put you on this space. This is a space of importance so that you can show how good it is to be a Muslim. Aha. And what will it take to show how good it is to be a Muslim? Well, here's what we need you to approve. A, B, C, D, E, F. One of those things is that we don't do gender equality. We don't talk that. We don't have time for that. It has to be the things that we, as the religious leaders, men and women, by the way, are in agreement about. And this gender equality business is very precarious. So yes, of course, we love our women, we promote our women, et cetera, up to a certain point, but we don't, as an institution, as an organization that brings us all together, we don't need to invest in this kind of a space. That was just one of the list of not to-dos. Learning through that experience how you can cede space, you can cede even power, but you don't really, because what you're doing is you're dominating and manipulating at the same time. But how remarkable it is that you can appear and take all the necessary steps that, according to our principles, are all about inclusion and respect and whatever. But in fact, we are perpetuating a certain way of thinking and behavior that is ultimately undermining not only the individual, but who and how and what the individual represents. So I realized that I was given the opportunity to be a leader as long as I could fulfill the criteria for what, in their perspective, being a good Muslim, Arab, North African woman should be. That if I veer from that, and I had a whole guidance of how I would veer from that, I am no longer, imagine the responsibility. I am no longer good. I'm no longer Muslim. I'm no longer woman. I'm no longer North African. I'm no longer Arab. So what a joy to come to terms with. Oh, is that all?
That it?
But those are examples of the challenges. How did I overcome? I didn't overcome. I simply plodded through. I learned a great deal. I made some of the most amazing friendships because when you go, respect is not about being respectful when things are fine. Respect is about showing respect and care and consideration and nurture when things are really not fine. When tensions and conflicts and hatred is at its highest, that's when we are put to the test. That's when the real metal shines. And because all of these were very, very difficult and challenging dynamics, the friendships that were created, the mentors that were there were also some of the most critical and important and life-changing in my world. I think it's highly, frankly, a bit silly to say, well, we're all respectful when everything's going fine. No. Are we respectful when things are really, really tough? That's the big thing. And I think that's one of the many things I learned.
You really bring up an important point, is that there are some challenges that we can't overcome because there are cultures and communities and institutions that are so ingrained in the way they are. But we have a choice of how we deal with them and what we can learn from them. And what it sounds like your experience in that really led you to where you are now, with this helping people with the skills to see these things that are in front of them, and help shift those challenges. So what can you tell us some of the successes that you've had with those places where people were willing to engage and were willing to shift, to bridge those differences and move forward?
So I think perhaps one of the most recent, if you will, sense of gratitude that I had to see something happen that I worked hard to try to make happen with a number of colleagues from across the system is now when you look at the UN scape, the United Nations scape, when I first entered in 2004, I was told, we don't do religion. We just don't do religion. We don't have time for that. We don't do religion. By the time I left in 2020, we had a UN interagency task force on religion. We had a multi-faith advisory council of over 40 global faith-based organizations that were advisors to the interagency task force, of which Tanenbaum proudly is a member. We have two structures inside the United Nations system that are still functioning today. And if you had asked me 20 years ago or whatever, was this ever going to be possible? I would have said, I really don't think so. I mean, after all, we don't do religion, right? But we very much do religion. The United Nations system today is not alienating the religious in a way that it was effectively very determinedly doing before. Now it has its own infrastructure. Religion is part of the infrastructure within the system, which is a big deal. So I would say this isn't my success by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a success of consecutive and multiple efforts across the system, and it required training the professionals. You know this very well because you've each been doing this in your own organization. You had to work with your own colleagues to help them get to that stage where they are themselves competent enough on the set of issues. And it's a standard. It's one of the infrastructures. You've got to make sure everybody is as knowledgeable about the why of this and the how of it. And I think that absolutely was invested in the very beginning. By the way, in the 20 years I served, I had zero resources, zero. And it was deliberate because every time I would apply for some resourcing for the work that we tried to do, I trained 1,000 UN staff and about 500 faith-based NGOs together. Every time I would apply, I was told this isn't a priority and we're under budget cuts and we're restructuring. Didn't matter what year it was. It didn't matter what was happening. It didn't matter that there was money coming in or not. If we would have budget cuts, restructuring, don't have money. But ultimately what ended up happening is people came, the UN staff themselves, who were moved by their own faith that this space is important, themselves had to struggle within their own offices, units, divisions, institutions to make it to the training, come to the training. And the faith-based organizations were always there at the table, always ready to be there. So it took a remarkable, I would say, grace from all sides that made it possible ultimately to do this. And I recall very clearly, twice I was told, the position you're in, we don't need it. So it's an incredible waste of resources. You have two options. Either you leave the UN or you stay and you can choose a country office to go to where you work on something else entirely. Those were my two options. So I lobbied and created a third option, which was to be demoted twice. And I was deliberately demoted twice, willingly, which, by the way, in any human resources lore, I'm sure you all recognize this, is a big black sign saying, I'm an idiot. Abuse me to your heart's content because I'm willing to be demoted, right? And so it was. But the commitment has a price. And I think we make a mistake when we assume that it's going to be easier, it's going to be fine, that the results will prove themselves. And I hope so. I pray so. But we also need to be sensitive, I think, to the fact that to do certain things that you're deeply committed to has a price. And that price is not always easy to cope with. It might be extraordinarily heavy to pay. But at the end of the day, as my mother always said, you face yourself in the mirror if you have one and it's not broken, as every one of mine are, because my niece went around having a joy the other day. You face yourself and you say, am I okay with me? Yeah, I'm okay with me. Because there will be a day of reckoning with a bigger power at some point, and I want to make sure that I'm okay.
It's really impressive and inspiring. And I hesitate to say that word because I don't want it to sound trite, but it really takes a strong strength and core to know what you believe and what you're committed to be able to stick to who you are and really go back to both answering to yourself and to your higher power. So thank you for sharing that. It's really taking that to heart. And how much time do we have left, Azza? Okay, perfect. So one more question. And then after that question, I'll do a little wrap up and then we will have time for questions. So get your questions. So the last one, as I was reading through Lead Integrity's website, I saw in your vision to the commitment to use media to not media that avoids polarization. And I know after talking to our clients and I know people in this room feel very in every day that media has been feeding that polarization, and that infiltrates the workplace. I want to hear more. How do you do that? Are you working also to not just avoid polarization, but to use media for a positive, to bring some uniting and bridging?
The short answer is yes, and let me give you a couple of examples. The belief within the community of co-partners, executive partners, is that you can't just sit and criticize. Oh my goodness, look at what they're doing here, and this is absolute rubbish there, and how could they here? But that it is important to provide an alternative, at least, so that of course there is analysis and critique, but also where possible an alternative. So some of the partners who are themselves in the business of documentary filmmaking have embarked on sometimes spending of their own resources to create different kinds of documentaries that try to, if for lack of a better word, to show the different aspects of realities, women's lived lives and realities. For instance, one of my favorite, but there are so many, that we talk about, oh, these poor women in Africa who are so abused and can't find food, and their husbands and whatever have terrified them, and their kids are desolate and whatever. Yes, we know that mantra. We have it. It's all down. In one case, one of the documentaries actually goes to identifies many of those women who found refuge within, in that case, it was different Catholic sister-run organizations, and who have been able to learn new skills and reset their lives such that they could do for their children and themselves what they couldn't do before. And they spoke to that reality. Yes, there were tears. Yes, there was pain, the stories of pain. But above all, there's the story of survival and accomplishment and the relative simplicity of being able to get there. It's not a very difficult, we need tons of money, we don't have resources, we have to find resources. It's actually very little amount that was able to get so many of these women to stand back on their feet and to be able to stay there, to say and share the stories not only of their survival, not only of the fact that they're thriving, but how their children were thriving, some of them severely disabled as a result of the malnourishment that they had to encounter. But to see the story, not as one of, but hey, here's what it took to thrive. And it wasn't so much. It was actually just a tremendous amount of commitment and a heck of a lot of love, and a belief that if you love enough, you will find the resources that you need, rather than have to spend time putting together proposals and foundations and whatever. You could actually just invest in the individuals around you and in those relationships. And somehow, as the nuns love to say, God provides. God provides. People step in, organizations step in. It's there. Another has to do with the Amazon. Now, we all supposedly, we've only got something like 25% of the Amazon forests left. And those are, to a large extent, even I've been told rather different, but to a large extent, these are kind of like the lungs of our planet. Okay. And big, huge brouhaha about different initiatives and efforts to save the rainforest. The Amazon this, the Amazon that, this president, this, that. Nobody thought to focus on the indigenous women in the Amazon whose livelihoods this is. This is their home. This is their literally where they live and how they work and bring up their families. No one thought to focus a little bit on that component. So we're so busy looking at these big endeavors, big industrial bad guys or good guys, and no one thought to focus on the women. One of our partners decided, completely without any resources, to go and just document how some of these women were living, some of these indigenous women were living. She started this about 3 years ago, ever since she completed this movie. And like I said, it was on her own budget. She received very, very little. I gave a very small amount from Religions for Peace at that time. Honestly, a very nominal amount. It was pathetic. Somehow she found the resources to go and do 5 countries. It's been receiving one award after the other. It's not a massively incredible movie. It's just a story. of women that shows their reality, their truth. And it's so beautifully done. And there are so many more examples. I think the point is you have to provide the alternative. And again, sometimes, if not most times, you have to kind of sacrifice a bit for it.
It's such a great reminder that there's always more to the story, that every time we have a complaint about something, every time that there seems to be a negative out there, if we dig a little deeper and we take the time to listen to the people who are actually on the ground and are in living it, we'd be amazed at what the positive is. And I think that that's, there's, I don't know why, but tragedy seems to sell more. I know I personally don't read the news because it's tragedy. I'd read the news more if there was more positive stories. I don't know, maybe I'm just wired differently, but actually I think it's that I wonder if it's the media's in such a rut, because as your example, these small movies and documentaries get huge showings and people respond so positively, and people are hungry for these positive stories. And the more that we can get out there and share them, and to remember, I think that with the story of the Amazon, we're looking at the big corporations and big actors to make the difference, when it's really the small actors, which the small steps that really we each can take. I mean, and I think that that's a big part of what you do, is the individual conversations. Going back to where you started in that elevator at the UN, that who knows what that small conversation might have led to, because being able to be in that discomfort. But and I would have a feeling, being the Jew on the other side of the elevator, that person might even been longing and wanting to, like, well, what did she think of me? And because usually what you're thinking is, and the fears that you have are the same that the other person does too. So I wrote a couple things that I just heard from your stories that I wanted to pull out. And one, and I think that this goes true to the core of what we at Tanenbaum do, is that it's a skill set of digging into that discomfort and having these conversations. And I know that those who work in DEI also know that it's a skill set. It's nothing that not always, some people comes naturally, but most of us it doesn't. And that you can build those skills. And that the trust is important, but it might not start there, but there are ways to build it through those small interactions. And I loved your story about that's even, and as we build that trust, we can start digging into challenging each other.
And if I may, just to
Please.
nuance a bit, it's not the trust. It is that trust doesn't come automatically. Trust is something you have to invest deliberately in building and creating with one another. It doesn't come by virtue of, oh, we worked together for the last 25 years. Does not mean I trust this person. It's a different genre of relationship, and it requires its own special investment of our energies, our hearts and minds.
And I just brought questions. I wonder, how do you decide who those people are that you're willing to invest in that trust? And then, because we have to work with people that we are not willing to invest that trust in. And so how do you work with people that you might not have all levels of trust? Maybe there are some levels of trust you have.
It requires radical uncertainty and courage. And I think it's a determination, and it will honestly differ from one person to the other. But I have found in my own career that I will first be open to investing all I got in building trust. In a good 75% of the cases, I will get so badly beaten. But there's the 25% in which the most joyous thing happens, and that trust continues and is built and is just part of the strength that one can get. But it takes being committed to getting hurt, to that possibility that you'll get hurt. My experience, I don't recommend that approach to everyone, but that has been how I continue to live, is the commitment to building the trust even at the cost of getting hurt.
That takes a lot of resilience, inner strength.
Some call it stupidity.
So actually, one last question before we open up to questions, and same question that Mark asked our panelists this morning. What gives you hope?
People I meet, encounters, my faith. I'm a Muslim, in case I haven't noted. My faith demands, one of the key demands of my faith is that I never lose hope in the Almighty. That the minute I lose hope in the Almighty, I have lost my faith. And by the way, I still don't get it. Like, I still don't get it. I'm still like, really? Just believe? Just let it go. Islam is letting it go. That dramatic, radical, I won't control this. I cannot control this. I am not controlling this, but God will control it and it will be okay. And it's that intensity of faith that if I don't have it, I'm not a Muslim. Forget about all the other things that they tell you about, oh, you've got to pray and you've got to fast and that's all important, I'm sure. But it starts and it ends with that absolute faith in the Creator, and that's it. And I can't control and I am a control freak. But you know what? I can't. And it'll be okay. Because that Creator's there.
And with that, any questions in the room or online?
Thank you. This one works. Thank you very much for your time and for being so vulnerable. I have a question around how does this translate building trust with radical uncertainty in the workplace?
So as someone who's gotten beaten up repeatedly by trying to implement that, I would say it's a certain way of interacting with every single colleague at whatever level, with every single coworker at whatever level, with every single written document about whatever issue. It is that openness to say, I'm going to show who I am, what I am, how I feel, what I believe. I'm going to explain it to the best of my abilities, and I'm going to leave the rest to God to help out here. But that radical openness to being willing to take that risk that I may be severely misunderstood, I may be hurt, I may even lose my job. A lot of things may go wrong. But there's also that opportunity that something may go really, really well. But it's honesty. It's just honesty. And sometimes honesty can be terrifying. Most times honesty can be deeply threatening to others, deeply threatening to others. But sometimes being able to be vulnerable can be the key to being unthreatening. And frankly, those who get threatened by vulnerability, it's important that we know them. It's important that we understand that this is a kind of person or relationship that is feeling very threatened by my vulnerability. I need to know that. I need to be able to not assume it, not be blind to it. I need to know it, because then it will require a different kind of interaction and a constant engagement and a maybe even open question about how can I make you feel more comfortable about who I am and what I am? What do I need to do? But it is that absolute commitment to being honest about with oneself, about oneself, with others. I don't have any other solution, to be honest. And it's not an easy one, and it's not one that has any guarantees. Absolutely none. Which makes it very difficult, because you're embarking on God knows where.
Okay, it's radical uncertainty.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. So I could listen to you talk all day. I wanted to go back to the point that you were making about not trust, but the vulnerability and what it's inserted. One of the things that I see.
The microphone isn't on, or you're.
Okay.
Venus right, just put it closer.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
One of the things we hear a lot, and we're actually going to be doing some work this afternoon from practitioners, is the exhaustion. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you, over time, and the various ways, maybe different ways that it's shown up, what did you do, or how did you engage in restoration? Because I think the vulnerability that you speak about is actually a dimension of faith, to practice, and it can be exhausting to hold yourself that wide open to the world all the time. So could you talk a little bit just about kind of like how you maintain it and wait for me to go back into it like that?
Thank you. That is a very profound question. I haven't figured it out yet. So I can just share with you that the determination to make time to look after yourself, which is often considered a luxury, and all of us, north, south, east, west, are actually socialized into the fact that this is a luxury, because we have so much to do and there's so many responsibilities and obligations, and women in particular have the whole world to carry on their shoulders, and then. Okay, so it's a luxury. Now, to move ourselves from thinking this is a luxury to I so deserve this, I need this, I have to have this, is a mental and psychological, absolutely necessary shift. There are many, many examples of different things one can do, retreats, spa, the whole thing, it doesn't matter. I mean, we all have different ways, but the necessity to understand that we need to be looking after ourselves, and actually nobody else really does. To me, that's 101. And it's the hardest thing for most of us as women to do, to just convince ourselves this is necessary. This is as important as, you know what, I've got a horrible migraine. This is the medicine. I need the medicine. I still have my sister-in-law who will not take the medicine, God bless her, even though she's really suffering, because she shouldn't. She really shouldn't. And she should. But the point is, we need to have that. It's okay to do this. In fact, I have to look after myself. That is my number one. And as I said, I'm struggling with it myself. But the second thing is this. And this is over many years of working together with people from I accepted to be demoted in a system that makes it clear that that is the stupidest thing you can do for your career. It is guaranteed to ruin your career. I accepted it. I even proposed it because of one thing. I had learned with time and practice that to be together with people from different faiths has a healing power of its own, especially when we are acknowledging our different faiths, not subsuming, not assuming, but perhaps just even engaging in conversations about our different faiths. I have learned that that is one of the most healing experiences ever. I was ready to give up my United Nations career in order to get that healing and to make it possible and available for anyone who would be interested. There is a remarkable grace, mercy, call it what you will, that comes when people of different faiths come together. It doesn't have to be a specially structured event. It doesn't have to be. Just come together and sit and have a coffee, tea, nothing, walk on the way to the station, but engage one another in terms of what we believe and how we believe. I have seen religious leaders, men, reduced to crying when they came together and were discussing some of the most sensitive political issues ever. And they ended up, some of them, in tears because grace knows no boundaries when it is there for one another. And sometimes they would be shunned by their own co-religionist, but they would be welcomed by the others from different religions. The conversation, the love that was there that gets generated. And there is a reason why, at least in the monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, they always say, right, if two people come together to discuss God, God is there, right there. It is true. And it doesn't have to be monotheistic. If we come together, even with people from our indigenous communities and lands, when we come together to discuss our faith and to just share the anecdotes about it, there is a healing grace no amount of medication in the whole world can provide or compensate for. And it's worth being in those spaces. So completely worth it.
Thank you. That's a nice wrap up for this, because and that's why we're all here today. Whether or not, however we're connected across diversity, how I wonder if this is also one of the impetus for you being in the position that you are in all around the room. Not sorry, religious diversity, but diversity in general, appreciating the healing that comes from being around people that are different from you, yet not so different, right? Because we're all humans. And that connection that sort of that, and for me, because it really resonated, that has always been for me, that this idea that it's somewhat a comfort to know that even with all our differences, there are these core commonalities in being human beings that helps give me strength and give me hope for the future and for the work that we do together. So Azza, again, thank you so much for being here, for opening yourself up, for really putting forth a space for humanity, for vulnerability, and for building trust and honoring each other. It's really been an honor for me. Thank you.